It's been sitting on my shelf, and I've been itching to read it, but I've just not had the fortitude to pick it up. But I think it's a very poignant discussion for that. And just in 2020, Professor Finkelstein was named one of the 5th most influential political scientists in the world. So, y'all know what to do when I bring him out, right? Ladies and gentlemen, Professor Norman Finkelstein.
From the river to the sea. Palestine.
Well, thank you for having me. Unfortunately, because of the plane delays, I won't have nearly as much time as I hoped this evening. However, we do have the option of. You can't do two because of the feedback.
They'll turn it off.
I'll turn it over. Well, we have the option of maximizing the productivity this evening. So I think the agreement was I'd be asked a few questions by the person who introduced me, and then I'll hear from you. I'll do my best not to repeat what I've said over the past 8 months, to talk about new material. And with that, we should begin.
Well, you're just telling me in the back, Dr. Finkelstein, that June 6, 1982 is the very beginning of your sort of consciousness on the Israeli issue in the academic lens. Can you share a little bit about what drove you to actually begin to do all the work that you have done over the last several decades?
I'm going to try to be as brief as possible. I was always, from a very young age, I was involved in politics. That was not unusual in the 1960s. Politics was in the air, and politics was constantly a subject of debate and often heated disagreement. The main issues in that era were, of course, the war in Vietnam, and domestically the civil rights movement, later to be called the Black Power movement. I knew about Palestine, I knew about Israel and Palestine, but I can't say I was well educated on the subject, read a few books. And then came, in June 1982, the Lebanon War, and I was an active participant in opposing the war, and at that point I began to seriously read on the subject, and once I began to seriously read on the subject, I decided maybe I would write my doctoral dissertation on the topic, which I did. So now I had an intellectual commitment to the subject, I had a political commitment to the subject, and being Jewish, I had a personal connection to the topic, and all three converged. Now, sometimes people think I have an obsession with the topic because a lot of time has elapsed, nearly, now I guess it's approximately 41 or 42 years. But it's really not an obsession. I think it would be more correct to call it a certain stubbornness, namely the conflict never found a resolution. had it found a resolution, I probably would have been politically engaged in something else. But the conflict endures from when I first entered it in 1982, and I'm not a quitter, so I persist. It's true factually that by 2020, I did give up. I thought the thing was absolutely hopeless, and the books I was writing were becoming more and more and more and more detailed, and I was losing any audience that I had. So the last book I wrote on a very narrow topic having to do with Gaza, it only sold 350 copies according to my publisher. And of those 350, I purchased half. So it wasn't a very good showing. Actually, the book turned out to be, at this very moment, it turned out to be topical by a strange twist of fate. The book was called I Accuse, and it was directed at the person who was then the chief prosecutor of the International Criminal Court, a woman named Fatou Bensouda from the Gambia. And the essence of the book was to say that Fatou Bensouda was a crook, and she had conducted herself in a very corrupt way during the ICC, the International Criminal Court, hearings that had to do with Gaza. And then it came out last week that, in fact, Israeli intelligence agencies had been trying to blackmail Fatou Bensouda. In my opinion, they were successful in blackmailing her, and I'll have more to say about that in the future. So that book may actually hit 400 sales. And of half, of course, I will purchase myself.
So if we could just go back to your beginnings, because your parents, I first learned of you, after Operation Protective Edge. I was in college, and this video where I think many of us have seen it, where you were sharing the story about your parents surviving Auschwitz, and you weren't going to let them weaponize the Holocaust in the name of Zionism. How does someone whose parents grew up surviving the Holocaust, coming to America, not have Israel and the concept of Zionism, which develops right after that, to be at the forefront of your upbringing? Was it not so? Why was it not something that was etched? I got to tell you, I have roommates in college. One of them grew up Jewish. One of them discovered his ancestors were in the Holocaust and became a very staunch Zionist. So I'm curious, what is it about your upbringing that did not lead you towards that direction?
Well, the simple answer to that question is experience in and of itself does not determine any single answer to that experience. Two people can go through the identical experience and come out with totally different conclusions from that experience. So in the case of the Nazi Holocaust, basically you could say there were two kinds of conclusions people drew. One was never again to Jews, that we will now look after our own and we will do whatever needs to be done to defend our own. So that was the never again to Jews. And my impression is, I could be wrong, most Jews who passed through the Nazi Holocaust came to that conclusion. But there was another group of people who came to the conclusion, never again to anybody. So they passed to the exact same conclusion, the exact same experience. But they walked away saying that everybody who is suffering oppression is worthy of and deserving of support. And I would say, not to idealize my parents, they had many imperfections. And one of the sad parts of getting older is you begin to discover in your own mind's eye all the imperfections they had. Not to say I myself don't suffer from 10,000 imperfections. As Gandhi liked to say, I have 10,000 flaws. And when Gandhi said it, I think he meant it. Anybody who has self-knowledge is aware of how many flaws, character flaws, they suffer from. Having said that, I would say my parents, at least in words, they conveyed the right message, and that I, like my two siblings, these apples did not fall far from the tree. There are probably things they would disagree with me. I don't think there would be any disagreement about what I have to say about Gaza. I'm very confident that they would totally agree with me. And I have been asked that question the first time I appeared on Piers Morgan's program. He did directly ask me, what would my parents think? And for me, that's a significant question. Namely, I don't want to ever be accused of betraying their memory, and I certainly would never want to misrepresent who they were. So even if there is a disagreement, I will express it. I would say my parents would not agree with me on this. But I don't believe, as I said to Piers Morgan, and then I checked with my brother, one of my brothers. I did call him and ask him for an honest assessment. What would Mom and Dad have said? And there was a concurrence between us on the question of Gaza. There would be, as the expression has it, there would be no daylight between us. So I'm confident of that fact. My parents had different personalities, and they did end up getting divorced, although at the end of their lives they came back together because they both suffered from quite horrible terminal illnesses. But I remember my mother once saying, however much your father and I disagreed about 10,000 things, strangely enough, we never disagreed about politics. Their politics were a little strange. But strange for me in a very positive way, because my parents, as I said, with all their flaws, always keeping in mind that mine are many more than theirs. For all their flaws, one thing I could say with certainty, my parents could not be bought. They could not be purchased. And there were many moments where there were opportunities to capitalize on their experience during World War II, but if it was at the cost of saying something they didn't believe, they wouldn't do it. There was no way.
So you were, I'm going to reference your interview from Case Western back in 2008. You had actually spoke about 2 weeks before the invasion on Gaza in December, right before President Obama was sworn in. And there was a lot more optimism on your part in trying to figure out the ways in which folks can engage those that were staunchly pro-Israel or staunchly Zionist. And then we've seen over the several years that there was a change. October 7th reignited that, but what shifts between 2008 and 2020 in terms of the optimism you had towards continuing to push this issue?
Well, on this particular question, historical perspective is very important. So let's just take a couple of examples. When Israel invaded Lebanon in 1982, actually, up until Gaza after October 7th, it was the worst bloodletting of any Israeli invasion. Now that's completely forgotten. Between June and September, the estimates are that Israel killed between 15 and 20,000 Palestinians and Lebanese, overwhelmingly civilians. If you take Operation Cast Lead, to which you were referring, Operation Cast Lead, it was approximately 1,400 people killed, of whom about 1,200 were civilians, 350 children. Protective Edge, which was seen correctly in my view as a real horror show, it was still on the order of about 2,200 Palestinians killed. The numbers on civilians vary, but all those numbers pale in comparison to what Israel did in Lebanon in 1982. Now, each time there has been a massive bloodletting, be it Lebanon or Gaza, each time that there has been a massive bloodletting, there has been varying reactions among the public. It's not been uniform. Lebanon represented the first major break in public opinion in the United States, but it was mostly limited to left liberal and liberal sectors. It's very hard for young people in this audience to imagine, but roughly up until the Lebanon War, Israel was seen as a leftist cause. It was not seen as a conservative or reactionary cause. Israel was the land of the kibbutzim. Israel was the land of socialists in power. Most of the original Zionists, be it David Ben-Gurion or Shimon Peres, they were all seen as at the left end of the political spectrum. So it was not until Lebanon that public opinion among liberals and left liberals began to shift. Operation Cast Lead, which began December 26, 2008, and ended January 17, 2009. For those of you who are old enough to remember, the demonstrations during Cast Lead were very large. There was a huge outpouring of support for the Palestinians. It felt as if it were a turning point. In fact, I wrote a book shortly after shortly after Operation Cast Lead, and the title was taken from an article by the Israeli journalist Gideon Levy, and the book was called "This Time We Went Too Far," because it seemed as if what Israel was doing in Gaza was on a totally different scale. And up until then, it was a totally different scale. But now, when you look back, Operation Cast Lead was really, as compared to now, it was small change. By 2014, Operation Protective Edge, which if my memory is right, went from June 7th, 2014 to August 26th, 2014. It was 51 days. The reaction was very muted because the international community and even the domestic audience had by this time grown inured. That just means hardened. They had grown inured to Israel's periodic, what Israel calls mowings of the lawn in Gaza. So the reaction was not very strong to Operation Protective Edge, even though it was a horror show at the time. The head of the International Committee of the Red Cross, a person named Peter Moorer, when he toured Gaza after Protective Edge, he said, "Never before have I seen the degree of destruction that I've seen in Gaza." And that's quite a statement coming from the head of the ICRC, the Red Cross. But even that, just to give you one comparison, after Operation Protective Edge, it was estimated that Israel had left behind 2.5 million tons of rubbish. The current estimate for Gaza is, believe it or not, as of last month, the estimate is 38 million tons of rubbish. As a matter of fact, one of the, I won't call it amusing, let's just call it one of the silly aspects of the current Biden peace plan, is it talks about a 5-year period of rehabilitation of Gaza, construction rehabilitation of Gaza. That's part of the peace plan. But if you read the expert opinion, it will take a minimum of 10 years just to clear away the rubble. 10 years, because the rubble, bear in mind, most of Gaza now, 3/4 of Gaza, by the time Israel completes its operation in Rafah, it'll be the whole of Gaza. It has been reduced to, Gaza has been reduced purposely to a howling wilderness. There's just nothing there. It's not just that people have lost their homes. The estimate now is approximately 1.1 million, or maybe 1.2 million, of the people of Gaza have no home to return to. It's not just that people have lost their homes, it's that they have no idea where to return because they don't have a block anymore. They don't have a neighborhood anymore. It's completely unrecognizable. There was an interesting story. I happen to loathe the person, but the chief New York Times correspondent over there, his name is Patrick Kingsley. This was about a month or two into the Israeli assault on Gaza. He was standing in a place, or as he describes it in the article, he's standing in a place, and he turned to the Israeli officer next to him, and he said, "Where are we?" And the officer named the place, and he said, I used to spend a lot of time here. He had no idea where he was. And that's basically what Gaza is now. Now, to return to your question, obviously, after October 7th, we entered a new phase in many respects, but one aspect clearly is the international and in the United States, the domestic reaction. A large part of it is simply due, obviously, to the magnitude of destruction and to the changed nature of the Israeli objective. It is my opinion, having studied it quite closely for a large chunk of my adult life, that there's nothing qualitatively different about what Israel is doing in Gaza. It always targeted civilians. It always targeted schools. It always targeted hospitals. It always targeted UN workers, journalists. That's not new. That's old news. The magnitude, however, has changed. And to indicate what has changed in the magnitude, I think the following expression does indicate the change. During Israel's high-tech killing sprees in Gaza, cast lead, pillar of defense, protective edge, Israel described it as "we're mowing the lawn." That was the metaphor they used. You might note a very sick metaphor, because half of Gaza is children. So when you talk about taking a mower into Gaza, you're talking about smashing the skulls of children. The very fact that that metaphor was so casually used for a population, half of whom are children, and that it never registered how pathological that metaphor is, tells you about the sensibility of the mainstream society when it came to Gaza. But the difference now is very stark. Up until October 7th, the goal was to mow the lawn. But now the goal is different. The goal now is, there's a fancy word, extirpate. Anyone here know what that word means? I'm going to be disappointed if nobody knows. It's unacceptable. There are a lot of young people in this room, and I do not accept.
I see an old hand in the back.
I don't want to see one hand. There should be many hands up. Come on, guys. Yes. Not exactly to destroy. Yes.
Root out.
Stand up. This is our Arab Muslim Webster. Can you say it again?
Remove it from the roots.
Yes, it means to pull out by the root. And good for you for that. The goal now is to extirpate, to pull out from the root every blade of grass in Gaza. Which in the terminology of the current Israeli government, which they've repeated many, many a time, the goal is to make Gaza uninhabitable, to make Gaza unlivable. And in fact, when I was preparing after October 7th, because I had forgotten a lot of the details, I was rereading the book on Gaza. Can you just bring it up if you don't mind? Thank you so much. And at the very end, let's see. Here, at the very end of the book, when I was rereading it, I came across this statement by an Israeli. This was 2015. And the senior Israeli official, he said, another war with Gaza is inevitable. We cannot conduct a constant war of attrition, namely keep mowing the lawn. We can keep mowing the lawn. He said, therefore, the next conflict has to be the last conflict. And it turned out, those weren't my words as a senior Israeli official, but the words were prophetic, that they were not going to keep mowing the lawn. The next conflict would be the last conflict. And that's their intention now. So, there are many aspects of the international reaction, and I will be happy during questions and answers to talk about it, because it's at many different levels. One of the extraordinary aspects of what's happened since October 7th is, you see, it's constantly, the center is changing. One day it's the International Court of Justice. One day it's the International Criminal Court. One day it's the student demonstrations. One day is the extraordinary outpouring of support from UN agencies. There was a long time when you relied on UN agencies for factual data. They were very reliable. But now you have the UN officials, the officials in the World Health Organization, the World Food Program, the Food and Agriculture Organization. A large number, they're speaking out with, I would have to say, an impressive amount of courage and persistence. You even have, which I can't ever remember before, the Secretary General of the UN, in this case Guterres, who has actually been quite good. At the beginning, right after October 7th, no, but it was very tough right after October 7th for obvious reasons. So the reaction has been at many different levels, and in my opinion, has been morally very impressive. Why do I say that? Because at the end of the day, Gaza is a poor, powerless, stateless people. The people of Gaza are poor, powerless, and stateless. So, to be in solidarity with the people of Gaza means it's a solidarity without any benefits. It's not what they say, the Latin expression, quid pro quo, which basically means this for that, or you wash my hand, I wash yours, you scratch my back, I scratch yours. No, there is no return for supporting Gaza. It's pure, pristine, uncorrupted, unblemished solidarity. And the fact that there has been such a outpouring of solidarity. It's just very, at a moral level, it's very impressive. I don't have to tell any young people in this room how expensive college is. I don't have to tell any young people or their parents how concerned everybody is about finding a job after they graduate, or how concerned many people in this room are about getting into a good law school, a good medical school, a good professional school. In light of all those considerations, to see the young people on college campuses risking suicide as they pursue their professional careers, risking not being able to attend, as many people, young people were not able to attend their graduations, all for a poor, stateless, powerless people halfway around the world. And when you consider how many causes young people have good reason to worry about, climate change, nuclear war, an economy that's failing about 80% of our country, and they chose, of all the challenges facing them, all the causes that they could have chosen to invest in, the fact that they seized on Gaza, and notwithstanding the real sacrifices that that entailed, and to persist and persist and persist, it's a very impressive sight to behold. There was an anti-war movement in my generation, for sure, and I will never deny the moral element, the genuine pain that people felt at seeing the systematic destruction and incineration of Vietnam. And that was all real. But, and it's not really a but, it's just looking at the full picture. There was an aspect to the war of a genuine fear of being drafted into it. That was not a trivial concern. If you were a student, you got what was called a 4-year deferment for your college years. But then you were up for being drafted and dying in Vietnam. We had in our country at the time what was called a lottery. And the lottery basically meant they put 365 365 chips in a bag, and if they pulled out your birth date, within the first 200 numbers, it was a problem. Later, when our involvement began to diminish, within the first 150 numbers, it was a problem. So there was what you could call a self-interest in opposing the war in Vietnam. Now, I don't want anyone to walk away thinking that was the only concern. No. There was a genuine moral outrage at what was being done to the people of Vietnam. But in the case of Gaza, the truth is, there is no self-interest. It's a genuine feeling of solidarity with a people who have been martyred. I don't like, just for the record, I never promote my book. For those of you who've seen me on YouTube, you will notice everybody else, they have the book sitting on their back bookshelf behind, or they hold it up, or they ask the moderator. I never do that. I don't want to ever be seen as trying to profit from what has been done to the people in Gaza. But I'll just mention that when I wrote the book, Gaza: An Inquest into Its Martyrdom, it's a university press, and the university press means other professors or experts have to look at the book. And there was an objection raised to the title of the book. One professor who's actually well known and supportive of Palestinians, he said, I don't think an academic book should have the word martyrdom in it. It's unacademic. And I said, too bad. That's what's been done to the people of Gaza. They have been martyred. And that reality, not everybody knows every detail, but after October 7th, that reality set in. And we have to be cognizant that public awareness shifts over time. Cass led a lot of public awareness, Protective Edge much less, and actually the worst showing came in 2018 during Gaza's Great March of Return, when they attempted a nonviolent civil resistance to end the blockade of Gaza. And even though it was quite horrific what Israel did during the Great March of Return, it brought in its best snipers, lining them up along the perimeter with Gaza. And then, as the UN report, an authoritative UN report, it runs to 250 pages, single-spaced, it said that Israel targeted children, or to use their language, intentionally targeted children, intentionally targeted journalists, intentionally targeted medics, and intentionally targeted disabled people. It targeted double amputees. It did. They were 300 meters away from the perimeter fence. They were sitting in a wheelchair. They were on crutches, and they were targeted. The international community, and even the Palestine Solidarity community, totally ignored the Great March of Return. I don't think there was one demonstration in the United States in support of it. So I think we have to be cognizant that people forget. And it's possible that they will forget once the current round is over. It's possible people will forget. But it's also possible that that scarlet letter G for genocide has now been permanently affixed on the state of Israel, and that will not be washed away. Even with time, it won't be eroded or worn away. That's a real, I think that Israel has now crossed a line, even though, as I said, I thought that was true in cast lead, but Israel has crossed a line from which there will be no return. The very fact that there is a public debate about whether or not Israel is committing genocide represents a completely new level of public awareness. It was impossible to debate it. Now, some people deny it, some people affirm it, but the fact that you're having a debate about whether Israel is a genocidal state is something completely new. And I think there's a reasonable prospect that it will not go away.
So when you talk about debate, I want to bring up what is, I think, one of the greatest academic clapbacks I've ever seen is when you wrote an entire book to argue against Professor Dershowitz's book, which I know you're from New York, so Nas's Ether was the greatest rap comeback to Jay-Z ever. So you and Nas have a very similar style in terms of when you want to go after the person, you pick the medium in which they try to come after you. But not everybody can do that. Not everyone can be Nas, not everyone can be Dr. Finkelstein. So for those of us that care about this issue and want to keep fighting this, I think there's a couple tensions that arise. Number one, we are seeing the fidelity of the institutions that you mentioned, UNRWA, the United Nations, the ICC, the Court of Justice. Anytime there's a disagreement, there's an attempt to delegitimize it. We see this happen in the United States. If I don't like the outcome of the election, I'll question the integrity of the actual voting process. How does one navigate that if this seems to be the medium in which people debate now by just delegitimizing those institutions, if that's the first argument that we have to make? And then the second point around the solidarity piece, when people cheapen that solidarity to say it is rooted in anti-Semitism, that the fervor for love of the Muslim people and the Palestinians is actually subliminally because of the hatred that folks may have of the Jewish people. So how can one navigate that? And I'll give you a three-piece. A lot of young folks are protesting, and I know when you visited Colombia, you gave some sound advice that there has to be an ability to engage in a way that continues to bring people and not alienate. So the style in which folks protest, the way in which people discuss the issues, there has to be a calculus to continue to build the pro-peace, pro-Palestine perspective. So I know you have a memory like Zakir Naik, so I believe you're going to answer all those questions. And if you don't know, Zakir Naik is a famous theologian in the Muslim community who can cite any page, any verse of any text he discusses, similar to your style, Dr. Franks.
I had all those questions registered in my mind, but when you said that, I will go through them. They'll come to you. Just don't tell me. Oh, okay. The first question has to do with what kinds of sources do you use to convince people? And there has been a very dramatic change since October 7th. Up until October 7th, those who tried to convey a true picture about what's going on, they generally relied on the human rights organizations, Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch. There was the Israeli Information Center for Human Rights in the occupied territories called B'Tselem, and there are the Palestinian human rights organizations. And that was the main source of evidence because they appeared to be neutral and professional. The argument is, if you accept what Human Rights Watch has to say about Kashmir, and if you accept what Human Rights Watch has to say about the Kurds, then why don't you accept what they have to say about Israel and Palestine? But since October 7th, it's a very noticeable fact for people like myself who read the factual data that if you, for example, look at the South Africa application to the International Court of Justice, it's 84 pages. It has literally hundreds of footnotes, and many of the footnotes have many sources in that footnote. So it's a huge undertaking by the South African government. What struck me most was they didn't use human rights organizations. They just cited UN sources. And UN was always considered to be objective sources. They're very professional. They are. They're a very professional organization, and they're generally not swayed by personal or partisan conviction. They are accurate. And it was a real eye-opener for me to see that now the whole bureaucratic, institutional network, every organization, as I mentioned earlier, that you know, everybody knows WHO, World Health Organization, everybody here knows UNICEF, everybody here knows, let me take another common one. Well, UNRWA you know, but UNRWA was always seen as a little partisan. I'm just taking the most, the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, and they were coming out with these very sharp statements. And that, to me, it was a nice thing to see. People found their moral voice, they found their spine, they found their backbone. You even see a significant, not overwhelming, but a significant number of defections, even in our own US State Department, of people who are saying we cannot accept producing or publishing lies about what's going on in Gaza under our name. And they have left their job, some publicly, others privately. So I would say at this particular point in time, there is no lack of sources and factual evidence to draw on. It's a very impressive case that has been made, most notably by South Africa in the International Court of Justice. Now, that leads us to the second question, which is the question of trying to delegitimize what's now